Welcome back to the Wednesday War Room, where we're going to take a look at the Battle of Mons, fought on the 23rd of August 1914. We've been leading up to World War One ever since the first episode, concentrating on the tactical revolution caused by the magazine-fed bolt-action rifle. At Mons, we have the British Expeditionary Force, which has gone all in on trying to adapt to the new battlefield, defending the Mons-Condé Canal against the German First Army, who have looked at the lessons of recent conflicts and not been so impressed. Mons occupies a special place in the British consciousness alongside battles like Agincourt. It's a triumph of the plucky underdog against the brutish bully, the small band of brothers decimating a numerically superior opponent. Occasionally the BEF is even miraculously bailed out by phantom longbowmen, and of course there is the often quoted line by a German officer after the battle: "There can be no gainsaying it. We had been badly beaten, and by the English we had so laughed at a few hours before." Obviously things are not so clear-cut, and definitely do not involve the supernatural when you actually examine the history. The German officer who produced that line was a Captain Walter Blum, a then famous novelist who wrote up his experiences of the first few months of the war while he was recovering from an injury sustained at the Battle of the Aisne. Blum fought at Mons, and his account of the battle is very interesting, so that's what we're going to be focusing on in this video. How did Blum's unit, the 12th Brandenburg Grenadiers, fight at Mons? What was it like going up against the BEF? And how does the tactical level experienced by Blum and his men fit into the bigger operational picture? There are some historiographical issues with an approach like this, which I'm sure are increasing the suspicion levels of any historians watching this. Blum's book is a memoir written by a novelist. It's not a piece of historical analysis. Without a massive amount of context regarding the author himself, it's difficult to tell if he's pushing an agenda, but the broad details seem to fit in with other accounts of the Battle of Mons, and there really doesn't seem to be anything else quite like this out there. With that out of the way, to start off we're going to a different chunk of Belgium entirely, a few days earlier on the 19th. Here, the 12th Brandenburg Grenadiers are marching west with First Army, the far right arm of the great flanking movement described by the Schlieffen Plan. Ahead of them is the village of Kortenberg, between Brussels and Leuven, which appears to be offering resistance. Blum, commanding B Company, is ordered to attack. Blum's company is roughly 250 men strong, split into three sections, two under his subalterns, von der Osten and Graber, and one under Sergeant Schuler. Many of the soldiers, including Blum himself, are reservists called to the colours on the outbreak of war, which is pretty standard for the time. The engagement starts with von der Osten's section advancing over a ridge towards the village in extended line. They start to run at the double as they come under fire, then stop and go prone 200 yards past the ridge to engage Belgians firing on them from the gardens and buildings on the edge of the village just up ahead. Blum brings Graber's section up, and they reinforce von der Osten's firing line, covering the 200 yards beyond the ridge in three rushes. After a little while, the Belgian fire slackens off and some are spotted leaving their positions. Blum recognises that his men have won fire superiority and orders his company to advance. They rush to within 50 yards of the gardens, go prone, fire a final volley, fix bayonets and charge, storming the houses and taking the position as the Belgians flee. It's not clear from Blum's account exactly who they were fighting, except that it was a mix of Belgian soldiers and armed civilians. It's also not very clear exactly how much cover and concealment his company had or used in the attack. He doesn't mention anything like hedges, fences, ditches or tree lines, so it could be that they attacked across the open, something which may have been perfectly viable against a poorly trained or completely untrained opponent who is quickly suppressed. Regardless, B Company has conducted a very standard wave-style attack. The first line advances and forms a firing line. The second line reinforces this to increase the attack's firepower, and once fire superiority is achieved, the enemy position is assaulted with the bayonet. Blum even refers to the attack as if doing a drill on the parade ground. He does not mention taking any casualties. This is the kind of tactical level attack the German army wants to conduct in 1914. It's simple and straightforward, so easily taught and handled by reservists, whether they're officers or other ranks. It's quick to organise and conduct, and it gets results. And this action at Kortenberg has given us a template to help put Blum's account of the Battle of Mons into perspective. 4 days later, on the morning of the 23rd, the 12th Brandenburg Grenadiers are attacking elements of the BEF just north of the Mons-Condé Canal, specifically around the village of Tetra. Blum's B Company is a little under strength, having detached 1.5 sections to protect the battalion's flank, and they clear the empty woods north of Tetra, emerging to the northwest of the village. On their left, other German elements are engaged with British troops in Tetra itself. Ahead of Blum is about 1,500 yards of what he describes as an extremely long, flat, marshy-looking meadow with some scattered buildings at the far end, the line of the canal. Immediately upon leaving the woods, B Company comes under fire and takes 5 or 6 casualties. Blum quickly orders his men forward, with himself and his HQ team in the lead, the section leaders 10 paces behind him, and the section itself an extended line 10 paces behind that. Once again, he compares it to their training. Here we were advancing as if on a parade ground. They reach some farm buildings out in the fields, which they clear, and, still under fire, they advance by short rushes to a slightly raised road embankment where they go prone. Scanning with his binoculars, Blum identifies faint gun smoke around the buildings down by the canal, now about 1,000 yards away. He decides to close the range. B Company starts to advance across the meadow by rushes, in Blum's words, gradually working forward by rushes of 100, later 50, and then about 30 yards towards the invisible enemy. Every time they make a rush, they take a few casualties. Eventually, after joining up with a section from another company on their left, Blum realises that the combination of the distance they've travelled, the sprinting rushes and the boggy ground have knackered his men out, and he orders a halt. He reckons that he's taken about 60 casualties since leaving the wood. At this point, he also notices that the incoming fire is a little high. As long as his men stay prone, the British can't hit them. This is because they found some dead ground. The canal is up on an embankment, and the British riflemen on the other side can't see the Germans if they're prone. So, with roughly 500 yards to go, Blum and his men have a bit of a break in a position of relative safety. After passing around some champagne and having a smoke, because what else would you do, they start to advance by rushes again. This time, the incoming fire begins to noticeably slacken and almost stops completely. Once they get within 150 yards of the canal embankment, Blum says, "Now we'll do one more 30-yard rush all together, then fix bayonets and charge the houses and the canal banks." B Company stands up to make the rush and is immediately decimated by a hail of rapid rifle fire before it can go to ground again. Worse, even though they're in dead ground from the British in front of them once they go prone again, they start taking fire from a wood on their flank. Believing this to be friendly fire, Blum has a man wave a red flag at the wood to try and get it to stop. It doesn't. Blum doesn't realise, but it's actually a British machine gun section. Pinned down 120 yards from the canal with heavy casualties and running low on ammunition, they've been firing all the way down the meadow. Blum and B Company advance no further. A runner he sends back to report their situation and collect more ammunition returns to inform him that the rest of the battalion is 300 to 400 yards behind them in a similar state. They stay where they are until nightfall, when they are recalled by bugle and ordered to dig in, concerned about a British counterattack during the night. Blum is the only surviving company commander in the entire battalion. So what's going on down here at the tactical level? It seems like the two big issues for Blum and B Company are the invisible battlefield and the ground they are attacking over. issues they didn't have earlier when they attacked Kortenberg. At Kortenberg, B Company was able to start the engagement at much closer range thanks to the ridge they attacked over. This allowed them to quickly identify Belgian positions and suppress them with rifle fire in short order. At Mons, they didn't have these twin advantages. Blum never explicitly identifies any British positions or sees any of the British riflemen down by the canal. This, combined with a much greater starting range of 1500 yards, means that B Company never gets close to winning fire superiority. They've almost used up all their ammunition by the time they're pinned down, but it doesn't appear that all that fire helped them out at all. The only time it looks as if the Germans are actually getting somewhere is near the limit of their advance, when the British are luring them into a close-range fire ambush that stops them dead. The wave-style attack that 12th Brandenburg Grenadiers are practicing at Mons essentially relies on weight of numbers to get the job done. Down at the business end, it needs as many rifles firing on the enemy as possible to suppress him prior to the assault. In conditions where that fire is ineffective, it struggles. But it's important to remember that the BEF is the exception amongst Europe's armies at this time. B Company had no problems, and apparently no casualties, attacking like this at Kortenberg, and what's striking in both battles is how quick this method allows Blum to conduct his attack. He just heads off in the direction specified by his battalion commander, and attacks as per the drill. He doesn't need to spend time identifying and conforming to the cover and concealment offered by the terrain. He just lines his sections up like they're on parade and goes through the motions. This reliance on mass and speed might not look like it pays off at the tactical level, but it certainly pays off higher up. On the next day, Blum is somewhat surprised to find that the British have abandoned their positions during the night. The BEF might have managed to inflict a tactical repulse on the German First Army, but on its right, at the Battle of Sambre, the German Second Army has forced the French Fifth Army to withdraw after 2 days of hard fighting. That means that the BEF has to withdraw too, or face being outflanked. More than that, the German First Army might have had its nose bloodied, but it's entirely capable of following up the next day, crossing the canal and assaulting the British troops on the high ground behind. Again, the BEF is forced to withdraw. In the end, they retreat for 250 miles. So that emphasis on speed and mass, that force of officers like Blum who get their quick orders and can immediately enact them, allows the German army to rapidly put the pressure on the British. It doesn't matter if Blum and his men get pinned down and take heavy casualties, and it's worth saying that the German army did not have standardized training at this time, and Blum's regiment may be operating in a more tactically proficient way than others, because the enemy can't be strong everywhere. Somewhere, this pressure is going to succeed. It's going to turn a flank, or it's going to make a penetration, and that's going to force the enemy to fall back. All the effort and money expended in creating a long-service professional army meant that the British Expeditionary Force could certainly punch above its weight, and it was very well suited to small-scale colonial warfare. But in the circumstances of mass continental war, it was so outnumbered that the high quality of the force basically translated into an ability to avoid defeat, not an ability to produce a victory. And this was very much a finite ability. At Mons, the British army took about 1,600 casualties, and the Germans took anything up to 10,000, depending on who you ask. But the Germans had the mass to absorb those casualties. The BEF did not. The British army as a whole was only 350,000 men strong, including all the reserves, many of whom were tied up in global imperial responsibilities. And if this reinforcement pool could only be expanded or topped up with 7-year service professionals like it had been before 1914, then the British army was going to run out of bodies a long time before the Germans and their millions of conscripts. When Britain realises that the war is going to be a long war, it has to expand its army dramatically and leave the high standards of a professional long service force behind. In other words, the British had the wrong approach for continental mass warfare in 1914, and the Germans had the right one. The lessons of the Boer War, the improvements in marksmanship and the comparative low-level tactical proficiency of the BEF were simply overwhelmed by the operational mass and speed of the Germans. But there's another thread here that I haven't mentioned yet. Another reason for using Blum's account is that it relates what is basically a pure bolt-action magazine rifle engagement. B Company, armed with rifles, are attacking British infantry, armed with rifles. There is, granted, an incident where Blum's men are machine gunned from the flank, but that interjection is a minor footnote. They'd already been worn down and stopped by rifle fire by that point. The rifle purity of this particular slice of the Battle of Mons is in large part due to the terrain. This is a populated coal mining area with huge slag heaps, dense little villages and chunks of thick woodland breaking up fields of fire and restricting the ability of both sides to deploy and bring their big guns to bear. By 1914, all of the improvements that have seen the infantry's weapons vastly increase in range, accuracy, muzzle velocity and rate of fire have been scaled up successfully and applied to the artillery. The tactical significance of the bolt-action magazine-fed rifle is quickly overridden by the tactical significance of breech-loading, rapid-firing, recoil-compensated artillery. Later, when Walter Blum is injured at the Battle of the Aisne, he is not struck by a rifle bullet. He, like the vast majority of First World War casualties, is wounded by artillery fire. For a brief window of time, due to mismatches in the speed of technical development, the bolt-action magazine-fed rifle dominated the battlefield. But by 1914, that window had closed. The artillery had caught up and exceeded the rifle to take its place at the top of the battlefield food chain. All sides rapidly react and take steps to mitigate the effects of enemy artillery. Seeking to reduce casualties, the infantry dig deep and spread out. But this has further tactical consequences that see the development of trench warfare and ultimately the birth of modern combined arms. That's what we're going to look at next time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.